start our little recording. So yeah, thanks for joining us, folks. My name's Scout. My pronouns are they, them. I'm with SRS, and I'm going to kick us off tonight. Yeah, so SRS is a educational and action group that stands in the Marxist tradition of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, which Steve is going to get into tonight more on our presentation. And we are based on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people. So I'm going to give a little Duwamish land acknowledgement for those of us who are on Duwamish land in Seattle. And I know we have a few folks joining us from other places, but I would like to acknowledge that we are on the land, the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And for those of us who maybe weren't here last week, if you want to check out more, you can go to Real Rent Duwamish or check out the Duwamish tribe online. But Steve is going to give us a little presentation tonight about the SRS and the political traditions on the left and where we fit in. And we'll have that and some discussion time, and then we'll take a break around 8 o'clock for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and discuss and ask questions, all that good stuff. And yeah, sound good, Steve?
Sounds good.
All right, let's go.
Okay, so as industrial capitalism really picked up in the 1800s, the horrors of it were amazing. I mean, people lived in slums, and they died early, and lots of child poverty and poverty in general. Some people in Britain became reformers and decided that the problem was private property, and there needed to be an elimination of private property, and they supported some form of communism or socialism. Marx had come into that movement when he was in Germany and went along with that movement. However, he looked for what force it was objectively in society that could bring about a transformation from capitalism to socialism. And he looked to the working class, the modern industrial proletariat, those who work for a wage or a salary, those who actually produce the wealth of capitalism and were therefore exploited by capitalism, but also had the collective power to transform the economy in a more positive direction. So this is why he looked to the working class as the class that could bring about a transformation. Workers had an interest in abolishing capitalism because they were exploited by it, but also because they were exploited, but also because with their power, with their ability to transform the economy, they could actually produce a different kind of society. So this led to Marxism being called by many people, including a guy named John Molyneux, a British socialist, the theory and practice of international proletarian or working class revolution. So this is the key thing about Marxism. It was not just an abstract philosophy or an analysis of economics, but it was a political movement for the interests of the working class as a class that can transform society. So this is the kind of red thread that runs through the history of Marxism. We can look at how closely different tendencies are toward the original ideas of Marxism by looking at its relationship to the interests and power of the working class. Another way to look at this is socialism from below, or what Marx called the self-emancipation of the working class. That is, workers would have to create the socialist society. It could not happen from above, from a nice dictator or a parliament or whatever. So the first kind of division among people who were into communism or socialism was between socialists and anarchists. The anarchists did not believe that the economic system was the fundamental source of oppression, but instead the state was, or authority. So their orientation was to get rid of authority, to get rid of the state. It was not to create working class power, that is, overthrow the state and create a worker state, which could then transform society. Instead, it was just getting rid of the state immediately. So this was a difference. The Marxists believed that workers needed to smash the old state, but they needed to create their own worker state, a democratic organization which would organize society and move towards communism. That the capitalists, once they were overthrown, would not just pack up and walk away. They would have to be continued to be suppressed until all classes were finally eliminated, and then the state could wither, the worker state could wither away. So this is kind of the difference between socialists and anarchists. Soon after that, mass supposedly Marxist parties were formed in Germany, France, and other places. In Germany, it was the Social Democratic Party. And they believed in political action. They believed in electing people to office. So they disagree with the anarchists on that point. However, over time, they became more and more accommodated to the political system as they elected more people to office. And they began to think that they could reform the system instead of having a workers' revolution. They could just elect better people, pass better laws, and there would be a transition to socialism using the current capitalist state rather than smashing that state and creating a worker state. So this came to a head during World War I, when the so-called socialist parties that had supposedly followed Marx gave up on internationalism and instead adopted nationalism. They actually, like the German Social Democratic Party, the French, etc., supported their own governments in the war. So they became nationalists rather than internationalists, rejecting one of the basic principles of Marxism, as before they had already rejected another basic principle, which was revolution. So after World War, or during World War II, I should say, there was a revolution in Russia where a revolutionary Marxist party, the Bolshevik Party, organized the overthrow of the state in Russia and led the move towards a new worker state, which was, the new worker state in Russia was organized by the Soviets, or workers' councils. These were democratically elected bodies that were able to organize the economy and the society. And so for a brief period of time in Russia, there was a democratically run worker state where workers actually ran things democratically. However, that society was surrounded and attacked by 17 different foreign armies, including the United States, which invaded Russia, along with European powers. And as a result of that and the economic blockade, Russia was cut off. And it was not able to really begin the transition to socialism in a big way. In fact, what happened is the working class was decimated, was driven back to the countryside, was killed off in the Civil War. So instead of workers' power in Russia, a new ruling group began to take power, a bureaucracy, which was led by Joseph Stalin. So this new bureaucracy actually took power and reversed some of the gains of the revolution. For example, during the Bolshevik period, in the early part of the revolution, there was the right to abortion, the right to homosexuality, etc. These were reversed by Stalin so that they became illegal. Workers' control of industry was reversed. Internationalism was reversed in the sense that Stalin started to make deals with foreign powers rather than trying to spread revolution. So there's a fundamental transformation of what happened. There was a counter-revolution in Russia under the leadership of Stalin and the new bureaucracy. One of the main problems with that, however, was that Stalin was not honest about it. The bureaucracy was not honest about it. They said, this is Marxism. This is, it used to be internationalism, now it's nationalism. It used to be women's liberation, now it's socialist motherhood. It used to be, the right of people to homosexuality. Now it's let's uphold the family again. Those kind of things. It used to be democracy, and now it's bureaucratic control. So that's what Stalinism represented as Marxism. And unfortunately, throughout most of the world, when people thought of communism or Marxism, they thought of Stalinism. There was a counter tendency to that, and that was led by Leon Trotsky, who had been a leader in the early years of the Russian Revolution. He tried to maintain the principles of the original Bolshevik Party. Oh, excuse me. The discussion will not be recorded. It's only the talk that's being recorded. So anyway, he tried to maintain the original principles of the Russian Revolution: internationalism, liberation for the oppressed, democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And he set up groups around the world to push that. However, that was very much a minority tendency, and most people thought of Stalinism as Marxism. Now, after World War II, Trotsky actually was assassinated by Stalin's agent in 1940. After World War II, the Stalinist bureaucracy was able to take over Eastern Europe and set up states that were very similar to what existed in Russia. That is top-down, bureaucratic, without workers' control, et cetera. So that's what happened after World War II. So this presented the Trotskyist movement with a dilemma. They could either stick with Trotsky's original idea that Russia was still some kind of a worker state, or they could understand that there had been a transformation. And the tendency out of which we come believed that Russia had become state capitalist. That is, the state owned the economy, but the state itself was run by a bureaucratic ruling class. And that was true of Eastern Europe as well as Russia, and later China, Cuba, et cetera. So this was our analysis at the time. And we thought that analysis best represented the idea of self-emancipation of the working class. You could not have a worker state like in Eastern Europe where workers had never made a revolution. And because self-emancipation of the working class is the core of Marxism. So today, of course, that's now 30 years since the Cold War. So the key issues today on the left are the following: the real nature of socialism, that is a rejection of Stalinism, internationalism, solidarity with the working class people around the world, all over the world, and opposition to imperialism all over the world, or to ruling classes all over the world. So we don't support any of the rival ruling classes in the world. Instead, we support worker struggle everywhere. So that's the key thing about internationalism as part of Marxism. We unite the fight against exploitation and oppression. That is, we believe that, as the early Bolsheviks did, that the working class movement, the socialist movement, has to directly take on the fight against any form of oppression. Has to be active in the fight against, for example, against racism, sexism, et cetera. And that these fights are not separate, that they need to be integrated into the fight against exploitation. This differs from other people on the left. One wing are the people who believe in class reductionism. That is, they believe that if you just push forward demands that impact the whole working class, then eventually oppressed people will be raised up. So they, support Medicare for all, public housing, free college tuition. All of these things are great. We're all for them, but they think that's enough. Whereas we believe there needs to be a direct fight for, against oppression, for things like Black Lives Matter, affirmative action, reparations, et cetera. So we believe that these fights need to be consolidated. The other thing is there are people among there are people on the left who believe that separate fights can bring about the end of oppression. We don't believe that that's possible, that capitalism itself has to be overthrown to get rid of oppression. We also have a rank and file orientation within the unions. That is, we understand that unions are a very positive thing for workers. They help to raise their wages and working conditions. But within the unions, a bureaucracy develops which negotiates contracts, and therefore it has its own separate interests from those of the workers. And so we need to have, workers need to organize themselves independently to fight for their own interests within the unions. We also believe in class independence, as Marx did from the very beginning. That is, the working class needs its own parties and movements, and we therefore do not support any of the bourgeois parties, the capitalist parties, Democrats, Republicans, etc., because they are all fighting in the interests of the capitalist class and not the working class. So we don't support candidates of the ruling class parties. And finally, we believe in the need for a revolutionary party that can organize the fight for workers' power. That is, if workers are not organized to fight for workers' power, they won't be able to achieve it. So then briefly, let me just discuss some of the other groups on the left in Seattle. There are many others, but just to touch on a few. Party of Socialism and Liberation is what we call campist. That is, they support the anti-US imperialist camps in the world. That is China, Assad in Syria, etc. And so that this is a rejection of Marx's idea of real internationalism. DSA is probably the most prominent socialist group in the US with 100,000 members. They have a lot of different tendencies and there are revolutionaries within it and so forth. But DSA as a whole fights for or supports the Democratic Party and elections as the way to bring about socialism rather than revolution. The various communist parties in the United States come from a Stalinist tradition, socialism from above, and they have, for the most part, moved over to supporting the Democratic Party. The Freedom Socialist Party here in Seattle is very supportive of China, for example. It is anti-Black nationalist to an extreme, in the sense that the way we look at Black nationalism, it's not going to be able to finally achieve liberation for Black people, getting rid of the system and so forth. But it does lead, or has led, and often will lead, the fights against racism. And to the extent that it does that, we should support it, whereas the FSP doesn't believe in that. The FSB also wants to replace the Revolutionary Party, like go into coalition and push for the coalition to take up way too many demands instead of focusing those demands. The Revolutionary Communist Party is basically a cult around Bob Lavakian that's refused fascism, you might have run into. They were pro-Biden during the last election, that's pro-Democratic Party, and they fundamentally support socialism from above, that is being in the Maoist tradition. The US Socialist Workers Party at this point was a Trotskyist organization, but is now pro-Zionist, that is supports Israel. It has moved away from Trotskyism and towards Stalinism, and actually tries to accommodate to right-wing populism in the United States, which is very strange. And finally, the Socialist Alternative, which of course has Kshama Sawant as a council member in Seattle. And of course, we supported Sawant's election. We think it's good to have a socialist on the council. However, they are fundamentally reformist as well. They believe that you can use the state to gradually bring about or rapidly bring about a transformation to socialism. So they have a very strong electoral orientation, and they have given some support to the Democratic Party as well. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. So that's, I'm sure that's a lot for people. So if people have questions, be sure to, let's get those out on the table first, and then we can move on to more discussion. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.